This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 396, part 2, entitled Become Biconscious, the battle cry of the Masculists. Continuing straight on, Masculists accuse fluffy feminist hypocrites who want equal rights for women in the parliaments but reject equal obligations with men to share the burden of earning the living by behaving as fluffy parasites in the divorce courts, forcing men into the man-slave role after the divorce as he was before the divorce. Masculists are rising up. They are becoming murderously angry, and in time, if the gender laws are not soon men-fared, will take up arms and go on a sex war, assassinating the gender politicians who made these deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place, murdering thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, and if the sex war really heats up, will go out into the streets and simply shoot fluffy feminists. Such will be the level of hatred of Masculists against manslavery and against the many decades-lasting gender crimes committed by the hated fluffies against men. When Masculists confront monoconscious feminists, they will harangue these feminists, telling them that the gender crimes committed by men against women pale in comparison to those committed by women against men, by fluffies and fluffy feminists against men. Masculists will harangue them with slogans such as, "Fip up, you fluffy feminist hypocrites, parasites, vermin, to be wiped out. Get off your fat, unfuckable, parasitic asses and become fips. Become biconscious. Learn how women oppress men far worse than vice versa. We men are fed up with your childish whining, your inability to grow up and take responsibility for your own lives, instead of always blaming men for your own inadequacies. A lot of the blame for the situation that women find themselves in is due to women themselves, through lack of grit and guts, by expecting childishly that some white knight man will come save them from themselves, instead of getting off their own fat parasitic asses and flipping up by growing up and pulling their own financial weight, by creating their own lives and not relying on some man to make them wealthy, relieving these fluffy parasite women from having to shift their ass from growing up and taking responsibility for their own lives. As Masculists penetrate the mainstream media, they will paint fluffies and fluffy feminists as ignorant, as monoconscious, a term that will take on increasingly connotations of being bigoted, dumber, narrow-minded, as something to be avoided, as low IQ'd, as low-classed, etc. In time, women will absorb these masculine attitudes and see monoconscious feminists as ignorant, insensitive bigots, and express the same attitudes towards monoconscious feminists as men do, and especially as the Masculists do. As large numbers of feminists become biconscious, it's likely that there will be a split in the feminist movement, as the biconscious feminists accuse the monoconscious feminists of being bigots, closed-minded towards the gender crimes that fluffies and fluffy feminists commit against men, especially in the crime scenes against men called divorce courts. The monoconscious feminists, with their lower sense of vision and intelligence, will see the biconscious feminists as traitors, as selling out to men whom monoconscious feminists see as the enemy. The feminist movement will split into a class-based, IQ-based polarity, with on the one hand the smarter upper-middle-class feminists being more biconscious, who have absorbed more quickly the ideas of the Masculists, who are more sympathetic towards them, and on the other hand the dumber, lower-class feminists, being more monoconscious, more traditional and conservative, sticking to their old monoconscious line that it is men who oppress women, that gender oppression is a one-way street. The more the monoconscious feminists stick to their outdated ideas, the more the Masculists will harangue them out of the room with extremely angry Masculist diatribes, and the greater will be the disdain of the biconscious feminists towards the stubborn, inflexible attitudes of the monoconscious feminists. The Masculists can approach the media with a simple Masculist slogan of "Become Biconscious." which instructs society to become aware of how women oppress men, of the need for the men-fairing of the gender laws, for example, major reforms in the divorce courts, which need to be taken out of the control of the monoconscious, fluffy feminist hypocrites, the passage of the para, that's paternity rejection right, so that men are not manslave for 2 decades, being forced to pay for kids they don't want, which flies in the face of the two-faced hypocrisy of the fluffy feminists who have their maternity rejection right, which is the greatest form of sexual discrimination that exists. A woman has the legislative right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but a man doesn't. When monoconscious feminazis object to the para, while unconsciously accepting the mara, this utterly bigoted attitude of these monoconscious feminazis makes themselves hated by the masculists, and as future targets to be shot when the sex war comes, if these monoconscious feminazis don't convert themselves into biconscious feminists and help in the effort to men-fair the gender laws. Otherwise, they will risk becoming targets of masculist soldiers in a sex war. Masculists need to create masculist groups in every high school, every campus, so that young women are exposed to masculist ideas and to masculist moral pressure on them to fip up, to become biconscious, so that they understand how traditional female expectations on men, in brackets, that it's to be manslaves to fluffy parasites, close brackets, are gender crimes against men, and that fluffies oppress men far worse than vice versa. Young women need to be taught that if they don't fip up, if they don't become biconscious, then they will pay a horrible price by being made manless. Masculisted men, which will be nearly almost all men in a mere few years, as masculist ideas spread through the culture, will teach other men that fluffies are parasitic manslavers, as hateable, to be wiped out, whose fluffy parasite genes are to be removed from the gene pool by being totally ignored, not even pumped and dumped. Masculists need to educate young men that if a woman is not biconscious, then she is hazardous to men, to be punished by men as being ignorant, dumber, low IQ'd, low class, to be seen as an inferior woman, too dumb to have absorbed masculine ideas, so deserves to rot on the shelf, rejected by men, living her manless, loveless, childless, miserable little life. Masculists really need to push the concept of biconsciousness onto women and to society, so that women are pushed and pushed hard with powerful masculist moral pressure to fip up, to become aware of how women oppress men, and far worse than vice versa, so that women see that gender oppression is a two-way street, so that they stop their gender oppression of men and join forces with the masculists in voting for the men-fairing of the gender laws. Biconscious feminists can help tell young women who are finding it impossible to persuade quality men whom they really want to mate with, in brackets, to obtain quality DNA from quality men for their kids, close brackets, due to the fact that quality men with their superior intelligence are the first category of men to go masculist, who become conscious of how the fluffy feminists have taken over the divorce courts and have made marriage and paternity so toxic for men that men decide to reject paternity and marriage, choosing instead to live a lifestyle of pumping and dumping women, but certainly not marrying them, and even more certainly not giving young women their sperm, since they have rejected paternity as too risky due to the toxicity of the divorce courts, due to the hated fluffy feminists who control them. Biconscious feminists and masculists will put pressure on young women to vote with men, to have the gender laws men-faired, so that men become more prepared to be fathers again, so that young women can fulfill their deep desires to be mothers, which is pretty much the raison d'etre for most women, embedded deeply in their female DNA. Women can expect to hear with increasing frequency the masculist slogan, the masculist battle cry of "Become biconscious" in the coming years, since it's summarised so much of what the masculists are pushing for. Biconscious feminists are much better informed of what the masculists want and see that it is in women's self-interest to become aware of how women gender oppress men, and in fact worse than men gender oppress women. Without the men-faring of the divorce courts and the legislation of the para, etc., women will continue to remain manless, as men, especially the quality men, whom young women really want to mate with, continue to reject marriage and paternity, preferring the MGTOW lifestyle, spending their money on themselves and not on children, which in today's fluffy feminist divorce court controlled world, they have one chance in 4 of losing. These odds are way too high, so young men are telling themselves not to marry, not to have kids, and that the fluffy feminists can go fuck themselves because they, the men, won't, thus forcing the fluffy feminists and the fluffies to rot on the shelf, hated, pariahed and spat at, treated as untermensch. Masculists need to tell society that those women who don't become biconscious will pay a very heavy price, that they will lead miserable lives, that they will become very unhappy as men and society increasingly rejects them, castigating them for not being biconscious. There will be growing force behind the Masculist slogan, the Masculist battle cry of become biconscious. Those women who don't pay it heed will be thrown into the dustbin of history, wailing away their manless, solitary lives into old age and death. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 390 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.